Voice Media.
Picture this. It's a warm afternoon in Christchurch, New Zealand, June 1954. 3 women are having tea at a little kiosk in Victoria Park. A mother and 2 teenage girls, best friends sharing scones and quiet conversation. Nothing about the scene looks unusual. The kiosk owner would later say they seemed perfectly normal, just a quiet little group enjoying their tea.
About an hour later, those same 2 teenage girls come sprinting back up the path, screaming for help, covered in blood. And what they say happened next isn't true. Not even close.
Today, we're talking about one of the most infamous murders in New Zealand's history. A case so bizarre, it inspired an Oscar-nominated film starring a young Kate Winslet. It's the story of 2 teenage best friends whose friendship became so consuming, so obsessive, that they decided the only way to stay together forever was to kill one of their own mothers. I'm Amber.
And I'm Gina.
And this is the murder of Honora Parker.
Before we get into the friendship that ended her life, let's talk about Honora Parker, because in a lot of tellings of this case, she kind of gets lost. This is a story that's usually remembered for its 2 teenage killers and their strange fantasy world, but there was a real woman who lost her life here.
Honora Mary Parker was born on December 18, 1909 in Birmingham, England.
In the late 1920s, Honora moved in with a man named Herbert Riper. They told everyone they were married. For decades, that's what people believed, right up until Honora was murdered and it came out that they never actually were. It caused a massive scandal at the time. At trial, the prosecution mentioned that Honora and Herbert hadn't been able to get married, though they never really explained why.
Honora and Herbert had 4 children together, though only 2 of them, Wendy and Pauline, actually grew up in the family home. Sadly, one of their children was stillborn. Another was born with Down syndrome and was placed in an institution. Unfortunately, this detail would come up again at trial.
So I want to add a quick side note about how far we've come as a society, in some aspects at least. Down syndrome wasn't the terminology that was used at the time. And what was used was honestly awful. At this point in our history, a person with Down syndrome was called a mongoloid or Mongol because a problematic physician in the 1860s thought children born with the syndrome shared facial features with people of Asian descent.
Thankfully, by the mid-1960s, the World Health Organization officially confirmed the designation of Down syndrome, and by the 1970s, the problematic name had been all but forgotten. Interestingly enough, it was still named after the physician who called people with Down syndrome mongoloids in the first place.
We have to take what we can get, you know. Okay, back to Honora. Besides raising 2 daughters, Herbert owned a wholesale fish business, and Honora ran a boarding house out of the family home. By every account, she was just a working mother trying to hold a household together.
Now let's talk about their daughter, Pauline. Pauline Yvonne Parker was born on May 26, 1938.
When Pauline was just 5 years old, she was diagnosed with osteomyelitis, a bone marrow infection. She spent months in the hospital and went through a series of painful treatments and surgeries over about 3 years. 2 authors, Thomas Gurr and H.H. Cox, wrote about it later, saying that while other little girls her age were laughing and playing in the sunshine, Pauline had to lie in a bed month after month and watch them through the window.
That illness left her with chronic leg pain throughout her childhood, and she walked with what was described as the suspicion of a limp. Because of it, she didn't have to take part in PE class at school.
Around 1952, Pauline enrolled at Christchurch Girls High School. She was known as one of the smartest girls in her class, but also as a moody, scowling type with a strong personality. She wanted to be called Paul, dressed like a tomboy, and had short, curly black hair. That's also the school where she met Juliet Hulme, who was in the same grade.
So who is Juliet? Juliet Marion Hulme was born on October 28, 1938 in England to Dr. Henry Hulme, a physicist, and his wife Hilda. She had a younger brother named Jonathan.
Dr. Henry Hulme was actually kind of a big deal. He was one of England's leading mathematical scientists, and during World War II, he was one of two people who worked out the degaussing method that countered German magnetic mines. Hilda, meanwhile, was described as coolly aristocratic and was prominent in welfare work and cultural circles.
As a young child in London, Juliet suffered what was described as bomb shock and had nightmares for about a month, which makes sense given the time period. Then at 6 years old, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis. She got so sick that her doctor actually told her mother he'd be back the next morning to sign her death certificate.
But Juliet survived. She kept getting sick on and off, and eventually doctors told her parents she needed to live somewhere with cleaner air. Juliet later wrote about this herself. She said that at 8 years old, she was sent to the Bahamas to live with a foster family, which she credited with saving her life. After that, the family that fostered her moved to a private island off the coast of New Zealand, where she lived what she called a Swiss Family Robinson lifestyle of independence, full of fishing, building, and boating. By the time she was 10, she'd missed 3 years of school, but her mother had taught her to read by age 4, so she loved books and was able to catch up. She got sick again at 13, though, and never went back to school after that.
Eventually, the whole Hulme family left England and moved to New Zealand, where Dr. Henry became rector at the University of Canterbury. They lived on campus in a place called Ilam in what was described as a big, old-fashioned, stoned mansion with 16 rooms set in a sprawling grounds full of shrubbery.
Sounds lovely. Around 1952, at the same time as Pauline, Juliet enrolled at Christchurch Girls' High School. And she was smart, really smart. One IQ test put her at 170. A classmate described her as a fish out of water, but not in a humble way. She had a posh English accent, walked with her head held high, and wasn't afraid to correct her teachers. One classmate remembered her walking up to a group of girls clowning around and telling them that they were all being very mid-Victorian.
I might use that in the future.
It's a great diss.
So that's who they were before they met. Two girls who'd spent years sick and isolated, who found each other at the same school in the same year, and almost immediately, something clicked.
The Crown later said that after they met, the two girls became friendly almost at once, and their friendship developed rapidly into what could only be called an intense devotion for each other. The defense agreed the friendship took on an alarming intensity from the very start, and argued that both girls' mental and moral condition steadily deteriorated as their bond grew.
And honestly, there's a version of this where that intensity makes sense. Both girls had spent years feeling lonely and withdrawn because of their illnesses, and then suddenly they had each other. Hilda Hulme actually testified later that she and her husband welcomed the friendship at first because Juliet had always been so shy and reserved.
But it got intense fast. A local paper, the Star-Sun, reported that the girls' main object in life was to be together, sharing their thoughts, activities, secrets, and plans, and that anyone who dared come between them should be forcibly removed, which in hindsight is a pretty chilling line to read.
Pauline's father, Herbert, said later that Pauline cut herself off from her parents entirely. She basically stopped telling them anything, and after meeting Juliet, she became moody, easily upset, and easily angered. One psychiatrist who testified at trial said the girls quickly became what he called a self-satisfaction unit, more and more dependent on each other and less dependent on anyone else, setting the stage, in his words, for a break with society and its morality.
The girls spent as much time together as they could, often for days at a time at Ilam. They had a secret spot in the garden that they never told anyone about, which they referred to in their writing as the temple.
Hilda also testified that whenever Pauline was at Ilam, she'd talk about how unhappy she was at home, that her mother didn't understand her or love her, and that she was happier with the Hulmes than she had been anywhere. After Pauline described a fight with her mother, both girls would get so upset that it turned into an argument between the two of them. Hilda said Pauline told her that her mother often subjected her to severe corporal punishment.
The girls even stopped calling each other by their real names. Juliet went by Deborah. Pauline went by Gina.
Well, isn't that a strange coincidence?
Yeah, a strange and unfortunate coincidence for me. Yes. Well, together, they built out this elaborate universe, a whole fantasy world with kings and empires and characters they'd invented, which they called the Fourth World. Obviously, it sounds like a book I would probably read. One psychiatrist later said the girls had weird ideas in their own paradise, God, and religion. They even came up with their own saints to worship.
In April 1953, Juliet wrote in her diary that she and Pauline had found the key to the Fourth World. She described seeing a gateway through the clouds, sitting on a hillside looking out over a bay. There was a beautiful island with a blue sea, and everything was full of peace and bliss. Juliet wrote that the two of them had an extra part of the brain that let them appreciate this other world, though they could only use the key a couple of days a year.
They wrote entire novels together, sometimes writing letters to each other as if they were the characters, which they'd later combine into full stories. There was Charles II, the second son of the emperor of a fictional kingdom called Borovnia, and his mistress Deborah, who was the mother of his bastard child, Dialbo. Deborah becomes empress after he leads an insurrection and takes over the throne.
There was also a soldier of fortune named Lancelot Trelawney, who marries a 13-year-old empress with a violent temper who kills all those who incurred her wrath. Lancelot became emperor, and the couple had a daughter named Mariole. It was all incredibly detailed and incredibly strange.
At first, the writing was described as innocent and adventurous, the kind of thing you'd expect a teenager to write. A man named Walter Perry, who was renting a room at Ilam, read their first novel and said as much. But over time, the story shifted. They started to feature murder, suicide, sudden death, imprisonment, and bloodshed, in what one source called a disproportionate degree.
The girls also fantasized about becoming famous. Their plan, and I use that word generously, was to go to New York, get their novels published, then head to Hollywood to become actresses, while also supervising the film adaptations of their own books. To fund this dream, they came up with various money-making schemes.
One scheme involved sex work. They actually did the math on how much sex workers made and wondered if that could get them to America. Honestly, I just think it shows their desperation to leave. Another scheme involves stealing from the register at Pauline's father's fish shop. They even tried blackmailing Walter Perry at one point.
A psychiatrist later testified that ambitious plans aren't unusual in adolescence, but that in this case, there was more neglect of reality than usual. He said the girls had not the slightest doubt that they were outstanding geniuses, so far removed from ordinary people that they didn't need anyone's approval but their own.
When they weren't writing, they were acting their stories out, dressing up, sneaking out at night to perform under the moon. When they couldn't be together physically, they were on the phone or writing letters. It was consuming. And at first, both families were fine with the friendship. It didn't take long, though, for everyone to realize just how intense and how isolating it had actually become, and both parents began talking to each other about splitting up the girls.
In early 1953, Juliet was hospitalized again with tuberculosis and sent to a sanatorium for 4 months. When she finally came home, she was restless unless she knew Pauline was coming to see her. Pauline wrote in her diary, quote, "It was wonderful returning with Juliet. It was as if she had never been away. I believe I could fall in love with Juliet." End quote.
After that, their attachment only got more intense, and their stories got darker. The girls seemed to be, in the words of one source, vying with one another to see who could create the most bloodshed and sudden death. Every story had a suicide or an assassination in it. It later came out that Juliet had actually been given experimental drugs during her time at the sanatorium, and it was eventually discovered those drugs were mood-altering.
Both sets of parents were worried at this point. In late 1953, the Parkers and the Hulmes both went to the same family doctor, a man named Francis Bennett, about how close the girls had become. Dr. Bennett told them he believed there was a homosexual relationship happening between the girls, and he suggested they be separated. It's worth remembering that at the time, homosexuality itself was considered a mental illness, so that diagnosis carried a lot of weight with these families.
The Hulmes were especially concerned. They thought Juliet needed medical attention for her brain and discussed it with medical friends, who told them Juliet was highly emotional and would remain, quote, a responsibility until she developed a less intense attitude toward life. They wanted her formally psychoanalyzed, but were advised it would be unwise at such a young age.
In April 1954, things got even messier. Pauline and Juliet found out that Hilda was having an affair with the Hulmes' lodger, Walter Perry, the same man who'd been renting a room at Ilam since December 1953.
According to Pauline's diary, on the night of April 22nd, Juliet walked in on her mother having tea in bed with Walter. When Juliet asked for an explanation, her mother told her that she and Walter were in love, that her father Henry knew all about it, and that the three of them planned to live together as a threesome.
The next day, Henry told both girls that he and Hilda were getting a divorce. Pauline wrote about it in her diary that night. She said the shock hadn't fully hit her yet, that it felt incredible, that Mrs. Hulme had been sweet and Dr. Hulme had been kind and understanding. But then she added this line, "One thing, Juliet and I are sticking together through everything. We sink or swim together."
And that line ends up mattering a lot, because the news of the divorce absolutely terrified them. They were convinced they were about to be split up for good, and their mental state, already fragile, got even worse.
Toward the beginning of June 1954, the Hulmes told Juliet she'd be moving to South Africa on July 3rd with her father. Both girls were distraught. They assumed Pauline would simply go with her, but both sets of parents said absolutely not.
Honora, in particular, forbade it outright. When Pauline asked Hilda if she could go, Hilda said no, that Pauline would need to be educated enough to support herself and would need her own parents' consent. And Henry made it clear he wasn't taking any responsibility for her either.
Pauline was allowed to stay at the Hulme home for 2 weeks before Juliet's scheduled departure. The psychiatrist later testified that during those 2 weeks, the violence in the girls' writing hit what he called a fantastic crescendo. By the time of the murder in June, the two of them had completed 6 books, plays, poetry, and even an opera together. And in their favorite stories, the main characters always operated above the law.
According to the Crown's theory of the case, the girls decided that the only way they could stay together was if the person most firmly standing in their way, meaning Honora, was dead. In early June, 16-year-old Pauline and 15-year-old Juliet started actually planning it. The plan was to pretend they'd accepted Juliet's move, then have Pauline ask Honora to take them on one last outing together to say goodbye. They'd lure her somewhere secluded, hit her with a brick, then run for help and say she'd fallen.
And we know all of this in remarkable detail because Pauline kept a diary, and she wrote about the planning almost in real time. It's honestly one of the most chilling parts of this whole case.
Starting on February 13th, months before the murder, Pauline had already begun writing about wishing Honora was dead. That day she wrote, quote, "Why could not mother die? Dozens of people, thousands of people are dying every day. So why not mother? And father too."
On April 17th, after Hilda scolded Juliet for going to Walter's room to borrow a record, The girls went and sat watching a writing club, yelling nasty things at the writers as they passed. Pauline wrote that it cheered them up and that when they got back, they wrote out all 10 commandments specifically so they could break them. Pauline apparently managed all 10. Juliet only got through 9.
On April 28th, Pauline wrote, quote, "Anger against mother boiled up inside me. It is she who is one of the main obstacles in my path. Suddenly a means of ridding myself of the obstacle occurred to me," end quote. The very next day, she wrote about wanting to make her mother's death look natural or accidental. On April 30th, she wrote that she'd told Juliet she wanted to kill Honora.
By May, the girls had started shoplifting and stealing money to fund their trip to America. Then on June 19th, just days before the murder, Pauline wrote that they'd nearly finished their books, but their real goal for the day was to come up with a definite plan to kill Honora. She wrote, quote, "We have worked it out carefully and are both thrilled with the idea. Naturally, we feel a trifle nervous, but the pleasure of anticipation is great," end quote.
The next day, June 20th, she wrote that they'd made the plan a little clearer and added, quote, "Peculiarly enough, I have no qualms of conscience, or is it peculiar we are so mad," end quote. On June 21st, the day before the murder, she wrote that they decided to use a brick in a stocking instead of a sandbag, and that she felt keyed up, as if she was planning a surprise party. She wrote, quote, "So next time I write in the diary, mother will be dead. How odd, yet how pleasing," end quote.
And then, on the morning of June 22nd, the day of the murder itself, she wrote, quote, "I am writing a little of this up in the morning before the death. I felt very excited. I did not have pleasant dreams, though," end quote.
It is genuinely disturbing to read a teenager's own words planning her mother's murder, like it's a party she's looking forward to.
I have no words. Now.
As a mom, it's like, oh.
You know, especially since my daughter's creeping up on this age.
Yeah, she is.
Anyway, on June 21st, Juliet told her mother that Pauline had invited her on a picnic with Honora the next day, and her parents said yes.
On June 22nd, Juliet got ready in a new skirt, apparently asking her mom if she looked good in it. Walter Perry saw her leave and said she seemed happy, but otherwise completely normal. 44-year-old Honora took the two girls to Victoria Park in Christchurch.
Now, to understand what happens next, you kind of need to picture this park. It sits up on the slope of the Port Hills in an area called Cashmere. That's a large, mostly flat plateau up top with a little kiosk where the caretaker and his wife serve tea. Along the eastern edge of that plateau is a stone wall, and the hillside drops sharply down from there into a wide valley, covered in trees and shrubs with a narrow zigzag dirt path cutting through it.
For about the first 400 yards, the path is fairly steep. Then it levels off for about 75 yards, and in that stretch there's a small rustic bridge that makes a short section of the path, maybe 5 or 6 yards, practically flat. That's exactly where Honora was murdered.
The three of them had tea at the kiosk around 2:35 or 2:40 that afternoon. The caretaker's wife, Agnes Ritchie, later said all three of them appeared perfectly normal, quite at ease, just a quiet little group. When they finished, they started down the dirt path together.
At around 3:30, the two girls came running back up to the kiosk. Agnes described them as agitated, breathless, gasping, saying, "Please help us. Mummy has been hurt, covered with blood." Juliet was described as almost hysterical. Pauline was quieter, very white. Both had blood on their clothes and hands, and Pauline had blood splashed across her face.
Agnes went to get her husband, Kenneth. When she came back, the girls begged her not to make them go back down the path. Kenneth spoke with them to figure out roughly where Honora had fallen, then told Agnes to call an ambulance. The girls went inside to wash the blood off and asked Agnes to call their fathers. She got through to Dr. Henry Hulme, who said he'd come get them.
While they waited, Agnes asked what happened. Juliet kept saying, "Don't talk about it, don't talk about it. I'll always remember hearing her head banging. Pauline told her she slipped on a plank. We had been down the track and were returning, and somehow she slipped on a plank. When Agnes asked if the plank was broken, Pauline said no, that Honora had just slipped and hit her head on a brick, and that her head kept bumping or banging as she fell. Both girls kept saying it felt like a dream, that they'd wake up soon. When Agnes tried to reassure them that Honora might not be hurt that badly, Pauline just looked at her and didn't answer.
The girls claimed that they'd try to carry Honora back up, but that she was too heavy, so they had to put her down. When Agnes told them they'd done the right thing coming for help, Pauline said, perhaps we shouldn't have tried to carry her. Perhaps we didn't do the right thing. Meanwhile, Kenneth and an employee named Eric had already headed down the path. A few minutes later, they found Honora's body lying about 13 feet from the little bridge. Kenneth later said the second he saw her head, he knew immediately this hadn't been an accident.
He went back and called the police. When officers arrived, Honora's body was lying face up on the path, her head pointed downhill, blood streaming down the slope. Her lower denture had come loose near her jaw. Her stockings and arms were stained with mud and blood. Near her head was half of a brick. About 4 feet away, on the bank, was a woman's stocking, blood-stained and knotted near the ankle.
It was pretty clear at that point what had happened. Honora had been struck over the head with a brick that had been placed inside a stocking. There were no drag marks, and her personal effects were scattered near her, so she hadn't been moved. And there was no blood found anywhere else on the path, which ruled out any story about her simply falling.
The autopsy would later find 45 distinct injuries to Honora's head and face, 24 of which were lacerations. Her skull was fractured. Based on the injuries, the medical examiner determined the blows had happened while her head was pinned to the ground, and bruising on her neck showed she'd been held down by the throat. She also had a cut on one finger, which suggested she tried to put her hand up to defend herself.
45 injuries. That's not an accident. That's not even really a murder in the moment. That's a beating that went on for a while.
So disturbing. The fact that young teenage girls could do something like that to an adult is just next level demented.
My brain.
Mm-hmm. When the girls got back to Island with Dr. Henry, they told everyone Honora's death had been an accident. Hilda gave them both baths and asked Walter if there was anything they should do for shock. He made tea and brought it to the bathroom. He also noticed the girls' bloody clothing sitting outside the bathroom, and not wanting them to see it while they were in shock, he took it straight to the cleaners himself. When police later asked him about it, he did his best to describe the state the clothes had been in.
When Walter checked on the girls again, Pauline was described as very quiet and almost in a coma, while Juliet was flushed, perspiring, and extremely animated. Nobody discussed what had happened. Walter just gave them both a sedative to help them sleep.
Hilda later testified that night, Juliet was in a state of collapse, refusing to talk about the accident and wanting to discuss anything else. At bedtime, Juliet insisted on reciting all her favorite poems over and over until she finally got too tired to keep going. Hilda said Juliet didn't seem to grasp the reality of what had happened at all.
At first, everyone around the girls, Hilda, Henry, and Walter, genuinely believed it had been an accident. That changed when a detective, who'd already been out to the crime scene, arrived at Island to interview them. Dr. Hulme actually asked Walter to sit in on the interviews with the girls.
The detective spoke to Pauline first, in her bed. She told him that she, her mother, and Juliet had walked down the path after tea and were on their way back when her mother seemed to slip on a plank, hitting her head as she fell. Juliet chimed in that she'd seen half a brick on the ground. When the detective asked how Pauline knew her mother was dead, she said, "The blood. There was a lot of it." Then he asked if she'd seen a stocking at the scene, and she looked caught off guard. She said, "We did not take Mother's stocking off. I was wearing stockettes," before adding, I had a stocking with me in my bag. We wiped the blood with it.
Juliet gave the detective a similar story to Pauline's, except she claimed she'd actually seen Honora hit her head repeatedly, which contradicted what Pauline had said about her being off in the distance at the time. The detective asked her directly, "Are you telling the truth?" Juliet hesitated.
Walter noticed something was off and asked to speak with Juliet alone. He told her she needed to tell the truth. After a few minutes, she broke down and told him what actually happened. And Walter brought the detective back in so she could repeat it.
This time, Juliet said she hadn't actually been with Pauline when Honora was killed, that she'd been further up the path. When she walked back toward them, she said she saw Honora already on the ground, and Pauline told her Honora had slipped.
The detective then went back to Pauline and told her she was suspected of murdering her mother, and read her something close to a Miranda warning. She didn't respond right away, so he asked her to tell him what happened. She said, "No, you ask me questions." So he did.
What follows is honestly one of the more chilling exchanges we've come across. He asked when she'd decided to kill her mother, and Pauline said, "A few days ago." He asked if she'd told anyone, and she said no, that her friend hadn't known anything about it, that Juliet had gone on ahead and was out of sight at the time.
When he asked what her mother said when she struck her, Pauline again declined to answer. He asked how many times she'd hit her, and Pauline said she didn't know, but a great many times, she imagined. He asked what she'd used. She told him, "A half brick inside the foot of a stocking. I took them with me for the purpose. I had the brick in my shoulder bag." And then she added, unprompted, "I wish to state that Juliet did not know of my intentions, and she did not see me strike my mother. I took the chance to strike my mother when Juliet was away. I still do not wish to say why I killed my mother."
When he asked if she told Juliet what she'd done, Pauline said she knew nothing about it. "As far as I know, she believed what I told her, although she may have guessed what had happened, but I doubt it, as we were both so shaken that it probably did not occur to her." She said she thought Juliet had just repeated what she'd said to the woman at the tea kiosk because she suspected what had happened, but didn't want to believe it or get Pauline into trouble. And then Pauline said something that stuck with a lot of people who've studied this case. She said, "As soon as I had started to strike my mother, I regretted it, but I could not stop." That got me.
It's like, well, I'm already doing it. So, yeah, a little too late for regret at that point, or second guessing yourself. Pauline was arrested right after that interview. That night, officers searched her bedroom and found 14 books she'd written, a scrapbook, and her diary, the one we've been quoting from this whole episode. A detective who read it later testified that it revealed the girls had engaged in shoplifting, toyed with blackmail, and talked and experimented with matters of sex, all on top of the murder planning we already walked through.
A day later, on June 23rd, the detective went back to Ilam to speak with Juliet again, now that he'd read the diary and knew she'd actually been present. Juliet apologized for lying and said she wanted to tell the truth this time. She said she and Pauline had gone to Victoria Park to confront Honora about not letting Pauline move to South Africa with her.
Juliet told him there'd been a small pink stone on the path, one she dropped there herself. On the way back, she said she was walking ahead, expecting Honora to be attacked. She heard noise behind her, loud conversation, and anger. She said she saw Honora in sort of a squatting position, that they were quarreling, that she went back and saw Pauline hit Honora with the brick in the stocking. She said she took the stocking and hit her too, that she was terrified, that she thought one of them had to die, that she wanted to help Pauline. She said Honora moved convulsively, that they both held her down, and that Honora was still when they left her. The brick, she said, had come loose from the stocking with the force of the blows.
She also told him that going into the park, she hadn't been sure Honora would actually die. She said she thought they might be able to frighten Honora with the brick and that Honora would give her consent for Pauline and her to stay together, but that after the first blow was struck, she knew it would be necessary to kill her.
Both girls ultimately pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity.
And this trial was a sensation. Between the murder itself and all the speculation swirling around the nature of the girls' relationship, people were fascinated. On the very first day, even though court didn't start until 9 in the morning, about 60 people, mostly women, lined up as early as 8, hoping to get a seat inside. To avoid the crowd, authorities brought the girls in through a van backed right up against the doorway and rushed them upstairs to holding cells. The courtroom stayed packed for the entire trial.
Oh, could you imagine how sensational this was at that time? Like, how many people were like, I gotta go watch this?
We see how things get sensationalized these days, and it causes a circus.
Mm-hmm.
Like today, most of the stuff going on there, like, that's just frickin' teenagers being teenagers, whatever. Then that was, no, you don't hear of anything like that. It would be a
scandal.
Complete debacle.
I wonder if most of the women that came were mothers themselves.
I would imagine so. And then back then, were they thinking, how did they allow their children to get to this point? Or they hadn't been around behavior like that. They hadn't been subjected to it. It's like seeing a monkey in a zoo.
To understand the psychology behind it, probably more than anything, like how it got to that point. It reminds me of the Slender Man killing.
Or just daytime TV wasn't as entertaining back then, and this was.
So you had to go see it in person.
Yeah, this was the soap opera of the decade.
Oh, 100%. Well, the Crown's opening was brutal. They called Honora's death a callously planned and premeditated murder committed by 2 highly intelligent and perfectly sane, but precocious and dirty-minded girls. They said the girls weren't incurably insane. They were, in their words, incurably bad. The Crown argued the girls conspired to kill Honora because she'd become alarmed by their relationship and tried to break it up, and that their resentment over that interference eventually curdled into hatred, and then into murder.
They laid out their theory of how it happened. Juliet brought a small pink stone to the park and dropped it on the path, then pointed it out to Honora, something like, "Look what I just found." When Honora bent down to look, Pauline pulled out the brick in the stocking and struck her from behind. The girls apparently believed one hit would be enough. It wasn't. Honora hadn't bent over far enough, so they had to hit her multiple times, which is what caused those 45 injuries. And by that point, obviously, it no longer looked like an accident, but they staged the body to look like one anyway.
The Crown also told the jury to set aside the fact that Honora and Herbert weren't legally married, saying it had nothing to do with the murder and that there was no evidence they were anything other than good, decent, devoted parents. Honestly, the fact that they would even
feel the need to address that. But again, completely different time.
Yeah.
The Crown called 3 psychiatrists to testify the girls were sane, and the most talked about testimony came from Dr. Kenneth Stallworthy. He said flatly that the girls were sane at the time of the murder, sane both medically and legally, and that they clearly knew what they were doing was wrong. He pointed to the diary as proof of motive, planning, and premeditation. He said Pauline told him directly, "We knew we were doing wrong. We knew we would be punished if we were caught, and we did our best not to be caught." Juliet told him, "I knew it was wrong to murder, and I knew at the time I was murdering somebody. You'd have to be an absolute moron not to know murder was against the law." I have words, but I'm going to keep them to myself.
Stallworthy also testified that the 2 girls were, in his words, very, very fond of each other, and that the most important thing in the world to them was being together, comparing it to other great loves in history, where one person would stick at nothing to be with the other. He said he didn't find any link between homosexuality and insanity and believed whatever the girls had experienced sexually was just a normal part of adolescence. Thank you. I also don't see how that has any sort of relevance. Like, it's totally normal at that age to be curious and try things. It doesn't make them abnormal.
Yup.
Yeah, that's not the problem here. Juliet, for her part, had denied a sexual relationship altogether, reportedly asking, "How could we? We're both women." Oh, Juliet.
Oh, honey. The defense, for their part, didn't even try to deny the girls had killed Honora. They told the jury outright that the physical act of the killing could not be successfully refuted, and that the only real question in the case was the girls' mental state at the time. They pushed back hard on the Crown's characterization of the girls as dirty-minded, calling that description unfortunate and medically incorrect, and argued instead that the girls were mentally sick, more to be pitied than blamed.
Two defense psychiatrists argued that the girls suffered from something called communicated insanity, essentially that they became insane specifically in each other's presence, like a really toxic codependent relationship. Dr. Reginald Medlicott, one of the defense witnesses, pointed to the health problems in Pauline's family, her own illness, her sister's Down syndrome, the stillbirths, and suggested that raised questions about, in his words, the stock from which she comes. He testified that the girls' friendship had proved tragic for them, that there was evidence it became homosexual, and that while there wasn't proof of a physical relationship, there was suggestive evidence in the diary that something had occurred, including references to bathing together and sharing a bed.
Medlicott said he believed the girls were insane when they attacked Honora, describing paranoia as a form of insanity that can hide under a surface of apparent normality. He considered both girls certifiably insane, but on cross-examination, he admitted the girls knew what they had done was wrong and knew what they were doing. He just argued they saw themselves as existing outside the law entirely. He also testified that both girls had been pretty nasty to him during his evaluations. Pauline apparently called him an irritating fool and told him he was displeasing to look at. I think that's another line I'll use. And after a physical exam, she reportedly shouted that she'd hope he'd break his neck. He said there'd been a gross reversal of moral sense in both of them, that they admired the things society considered evil and condemned the things society considered good.
The defense also called Dr. Francis Bennett, the same doctor the families had consulted about the girls before the murder. He argued the murder itself was proof of the girls' insanity, saying that once the threat of separation appeared, both girls became dangerous, believing that removing Honora would clear the path for them to stay together, and that neither of them would admit to any contrition or regret. He said Pauline told them she'd still feel justified killing her mother today if she believed it was necessary to keep them together, and that Juliet was even more outspoken, saying she believed other murders could be justified under the same circumstances. On cross-examination, though, Bennett admitted both girls knew they were killing Honora and knew it was wrong.
When Hilda Hulme took the stand, she was asked whether she thought her daughter fully grasped the reality of what she'd done. She said, "I would say definitely not." She testified that she and Henry had been concerned about Juliet's behavior and personality before the murder, describing her as always difficult to discipline and someone who resented being disciplined, but said they'd never once suspected she was actually insane.
In the end, the jury only had to answer one real question. Did the girls know what they were doing was wrong? With all 5 psychiatrists, the Crown's and the defense's, agreeing that yes, they knew, it wasn't much of a surprise when the jury came back guilty after a little over 2 hours of deliberation. That verdict came down on August 28, 1954.
Both girls reportedly reacted pretty calmly to the verdict. When they were sentenced to be detained during Her Majesty's pleasure, which basically meant an indefinite sentence with no fixed release date, witnesses described them as having an air of indifference. New Zealand did have the death penalty at the time, but the girls were too young for it to apply. They also weren't allowed to speak to each other again after sentencing.
Pauline was sent first to Paparua Prison, while a new secure unit was being built at Arohata near Wellington, then transferred there once it was ready. Juliet was sent to Mount Eden Prison, where conditions were described as primitive and unpleasant. She later told a magazine she was the only child inmate there, and that she spent her first 3 months in solitary confinement, mostly praying, crying, and repenting. She said, "I was guilty, and it was the right place for me to be."
During the day, the other prisoners did hard labor, but Juliet collapsed after 2 weeks of it, so after that she was moved to sewing uniforms instead. She described the prison as raw and brutal, with no fruit and no library. She said she memorized the few books she had access to, and that the nights, despite everything, actually became a kind of blessing, because it was the only time she didn't have to share a room with anyone. She said when the light goes out and there's nothing, then the light goes on inside your head.
After about 5 years, both girls were released and given entirely new identities.
For decades after their release, both women managed to stay completely out of the public eye. That changed in 1994, when a film called Heavenly Creatures was released, based on this exact case. It starred Melanie Lynskey as Pauline and a young Kate Winslet as Juliet, with Sarah Pierce playing Honora. It was directed by Peter Jackson. This was before Lord of the Rings.
It was the film debut for both Lynskey and Winslet. Apparently, 175 girls auditioned for the role of Juliet before Winslet, who was 18 at the time, had already done some TV work, got the part. Lynskey, on the other hand, had never acted professionally at all. She was discovered when the film's co-writer went scouting at New Zealand high schools looking for girls who resembled Pauline. She was 16 during filming and ended up winning Best Actress at the New Zealand Film Awards for it.
Apparently, the two actresses got so committed to their roles that even off camera, they basically stayed in character and spent all their time together, kind of mirroring the real girls' friendship, which is a little eerie when you think about it. Most of the filming locations were the actual real-life locations where events happened. The tea kiosk where Honora ate her last meal was torn down just days after filming wrapped there. Peter Jackson has said that when they got to the actual path where the murder happened, it was eerily quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and it just didn't feel right, so they ended up moving the scene a couple of 100 yards away. It's kind of how it felt whenever we walked into the cemetery at Salem, remember? It's just eerie.
Quiet and heavy and...
Yeah, very heavy.
Oof. I'm really glad that they didn't actually film it there. It's also kind of disrespectful, if you think about it. The film ended up getting nominated for several awards, including Best Original Screenplay at the Oscars. And the title itself actually comes from a poem the real Pauline and Juliet wrote together, in which they described themselves as glorious, worshipped, almost godlike beings. It's genuinely unsettling to read now, knowing what came after it.
Once Heavenly Creatures came out, the media went looking for both women, and they found them.
After her release, Juliet, who by then changed her name to Anne Perry, flew to Rome to meet her father, then went on to England. She spent years working odd jobs, including as an airline steward and an insurance underwriter. Eventually, she became a murder mystery writer. Her first novel, The Cater Street Hangman, came out in 1979 about a Victorian-era policeman named Thomas Pitt, and it kicked off a series that's now up to 32 books. She's written other series and standalone novels too, and as of recent counts, more than 26 million copies of her books have sold.
She said she never drew on her own experience as a murderer for her writing, that she actually tried to block most of it out. She said that none of the crimes in her books are described in detail and that none of them inflict more pain than necessary. She and her brother, a retired doctor, eventually moved into a restored stone barn on the east coast of Scotland, where he became her full-time researcher. She joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and never married.
I will say I'm a little jealous that she lives in Scotland.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought.
Yeah. It's like, well, everything else about your life kind of sucks, but the fact that you're a mystery writer and live in Scotland is pretty dope. So Good on you for getting it together. In September of 1994, once the truth came out, Juliet actually spoke to the media about why they did it. She said Pauline had been very distressed and desperately wanted to come with them, and that she felt she was running out on a person who stood by her when she was in the hospital, and that she was betraying her by just leaving and doing nothing. She said that she genuinely believed that if she didn't take Pauline with her, Pauline would take her own life, and that she made a very, very wrong decision. She added that she didn't have the strength to say no, that this was wrong no matter what, and to just walk away.
She's also always maintained there was never a sexual relationship between her and Pauline, that they were, in her words, just really good friends. She said they had all sorts of romantic dreams, and that while she likes women very much as friends, for romance, she'd take men. She's also said the two of them had zero contact after their release, that she'd been too busy just trying to survive and rebuild her own life. And she's written that she didn't even know about Heavenly Creatures until the day before it came out, and that she's never actually watched it. She just wanted to move on.
So, I have a question. We talk about how when creators cover true crime cases, it can re-wound the families of the victims because they're blindsided by it. But how does a person in this situation get considered? Because if you think about it, it's just as morally questionable that a film like this would be created about these people that are still alive and trying to live their life as it is in like the Dahmer situation when that show was released and the families were never contacted about it, because you're still making money off of someone's life and not giving them the opportunity to even know that it's happening before it happens.
Yep, there's a lot of ethics and morality missing in the Hollywood scene. Just gonna throw that out there.
And by no means am I saying that they're at the same level. Like, no. Dahmer victims and Juliet, very different situations, but still from a moral standpoint, it deserves to be considered. Pauline was a lot harder to find. Nobody located her until 1996, when it came out that she'd been living quietly in a village in the southeast of England under the name Hilary Nathan, living essentially as a recluse, with no one around her having any idea about her past.
After she got out of prison, Pauline actually went to the University of Auckland and earned a BA in 1964, then spent a year at the New Zealand Library School. Colleagues there described her as mysterious and secretive, apparently going so far as to deliberately miss the class photo. In 1965, she moved to Britain and worked at a library in London for a while before giving up library work altogether. By the time she was tracked down in 1996, she was running a small riding school for children, something she'd apparently always dreamed of doing since she loved horses.
Pauline's sister Wendy spoke to New Zealand Women's Weekly about her at the time, saying Pauline had no contact with the outside world, that she was a devout Roman Catholic who spent much of her time in prayer, and that she never married. Wendy said Pauline had actually tried to become a nun after her release, but wasn't able to. So instead, she basically lived like one anyway. No television, no radio, deeply religious, and mostly alone.
Wendy said Pauline had led a good life and was very remorseful for what she'd done, that she'd committed the most terrible crime and had spent 40 years repaying it by keeping away from people and doing her own little thing. Wendy also talked about having to decide whether she could ever forgive her sister for killing their mother. She said it was the worst thing that could have ever happened to her, that because they'd been so close growing up, she wrote to Pauline saying she couldn't believe what had happened and didn't want to accept it. Pauline wrote back saying it just got all out of hand, that she didn't know what happened, and that she just wanted to keep in touch.
The two sisters did eventually stay in touch, though they didn't talk about the murder again until the 1980s. And even then, they've apparently never discussed the brutal specifics of how Pauline actually killed their mother. Wendy has said she believes that at the time of the murder, Pauline didn't fully grasp the finality of what she'd done, and that it took her roughly 5 years afterward to truly understand it. Wendy also said Pauline never watched Heavenly Creatures, had no interest in it, and didn't keep up with anything Juliet was doing.
It's honestly one of the strangest parts of this whole thing to me. Two women who spent years utterly consumed by each other, who committed an actual murder to avoid being separated, and then once they got out, just never spoke again.
They got the one thing they said they were desperate to avoid: complete separation, permanently, and it turned out that that was exactly how they both chose to live for the rest of their lives.
At the center of all of this was Honora Parker, a mother of two, a partner to Herbert for decades, a woman who ran a boarding house and raised her kids, and by every account we could find, genuinely tried to look out for her daughter's well-being. She saw a friendship that had become obsessive and unhealthy, and she tried to do something about it. And for that, she was beaten to death on a hillside by her own daughter and her daughter's best friend, then left there while the girls invented a story about her simply falling. Honestly, yes, it's ironic that, they never got in touch again, but if they really were remorseful and understood what they did was wrong and regretted it, then I wouldn't want to talk to that person ever again either.
No, I think it shows a level of growth and maturity on both of their parts.
Yep.
That they realized that they were better not being
together. Yep.
It sounds like they both had toxic childhoods, and instead of being a positive support for each other, it just kind of fueled that.
And it really didn't help that they basically both lived in a fantasy world that they had created in their heads constantly either. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, you live in a fantasy world like that. The real world frickin' sucks.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, at that age, we've talked about this a million times. Your brain is not fully developed. You don't fully understand the consequences of your actions or the finality of something like this.
Yep.
Until it's way too late, which is what sounds like happened, because once she was actually in the act, she realized, oh crap, I can't come back from this.
Yep.
This is real. It's not one of their made up stories.
Yep. It's unfortunate.
It really is. It's sad, but I am glad that they got the chance to live out their lives. It's sad that they were both so solitary. Pauline more than Juliet, but once again, it sounds like they spent the rest of their lives trying to repent for what they did. Exactly. And all you can do is respect that.
Yep.
Yeah. We'll link our full source list in the show notes, including the trial coverage and the interviews Juliet gave after she was identified as Anne Perry. If you want to see how the story got adapted to film, Heavenly Creatures is still out there, and it's genuinely well made, if deeply unsettling.
We also need to give a big shout out to Haley Gray for her detailed research on this case. As always, you rule, we love you, and thank you.
Until next time, stay safe.
And make good choices.
Bye.